The Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, the Eucharist. These all refer to one of the most widespread Christian rituals, gathering together and eating some bread and drinking a bit of wine, grape juice, or in some cases water, all in remembrance of the death of Jesus. Now, the exact details of how it's done can look very different depending on the Christian tradition, and the theology behind it varies a lot, to put it mildly. There are long-standing debates about the degree to which Jesus is actually present in the bread and wine, or whether the ritual is more symbolic. But we're not focusing on those debates. We're going to try to answer a more basic question. Where did this ritual of the Eucharist come from? Now, the name itself derives from the Greek word meaning to give thanks, and it actually appears in the traditional origin story of the ritual, from the crucifixion narrative found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They describe how on the evening before his death, Jesus gathered with his 12 disciples for a Passover meal, and while they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The Gospel of Luke adds that iconic line, missing from Matthew and Mark, "Do this in remembrance of me." In his groundbreaking book, Eucharistic Origins, the scholar Paul Bradshaw remarks that historians of Christian liturgy have been anxious to trace a single straight line from this Last Supper described in the Gospels to the liturgical Eucharist we see today. The general idea is simple. Jesus instituted the practice, his disciples repeated it, and they passed it down to the next generation of Christians, eventually morphing into the ritual that we see today. But in the last half-century of scholarship, historians have started to complicate this idea. The path from the Last Supper to today's Eucharist is not so straightforward. As we'll see, the Eucharist does not seem to emerge from a single fixed ritual or event, and in fact, some of our earliest evidence makes no reference to the Last Supper at all. So where did it come from? First things first, if we're trying to understand the origins of the Eucharist, forget the modern versions with their micro-calorie portions. Nothing like a Catholic priest placing a wafer on your tongue, or a Greek Orthodox priest spooning wine-soaked bread into your mouth, or a Baptist preacher passing around saltine crackers and tiny cups of grape juice. This was something very different. In the earliest centuries of the Eucharist, Christians were not consuming a token amount of bread and wine. They were sitting down for a proper meal. Like a meal with actual portions of food, enough to provide some level of basic caloric needs. We see this in what's possibly our earliest reference to a Christian Eucharistic meal, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Paul was writing to Christians who apparently met at a home of a local patron for a meal, but there was a problem. It seems that the wealthier members were showing up, gorging on their own food and wine, while the poorer members went home hungry. He writes, "When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper. For when the time comes to eat, each of you proceeds to eat your own supper, and one goes hungry, and another becomes drunk." Paul encourages to practice unity. He reminds them that this meal is supposed to commemorate the death of Jesus, and warns them that taking part in an unworthy manner brings serious consequences, even sickness and death. Paul's description of the Eucharistic meal is grounded in two statements he says he received from the Lord, which closely resemble the stories found in the Gospels. "For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was delivered up, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me.'" Paul was writing several decades before the Gospels were composed, and scholars still debate whether he was drawing on an existing tradition or claiming direct revelation. Some note that he uses the title Lord to describe Jesus here, a term he typically reserves for the risen Christ. So scholars like Dr. James Tabor argue this might suggest he viewed the Eucharist as not a handed-down memory from eyewitnesses, but as something revealed to him personally by the glorified Jesus. But that debate aside, what we're focusing on here is what kind of communal ritual Paul is actually describing. When Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, it's tempting to read it through the lens of later Christian liturgies, structured, scripted rituals with set prayers and set actions. But that's probably not what Paul had in mind. As Dr. Bradshaw points out, even if early Christians believed Jesus literally said, "Do this in remembrance of me," they probably did not take that as, repeat this exact sequence in this exact way. First, do a bread ritual, then do a wine ritual. More likely, they understood it as a broader command. When you gather for a communal meal, whatever that looks like, do it in remembrance of him. Dr. Bradshaw writes, Paul quotes the Lord's Supper tradition in order to remind the Corinthians of the meaning that he attaches to their celebration of the Lord's Supper, and not of its ritual sequence. In other words, Paul's goal is not to lay down a liturgical script. He's trying to correct their behavior, reminding them of why the meal matters in the first place. So if he's not outlining a liturgical ritual, what kind of meal is he describing? Paul refers to this meal using the Greek word deipnon, often translated simply as supper, but as the historian Andrew McGowan points out, deipnon is better understood as a banquet, an evening meal with certain expected formalities and a tradition of proper conduct. These were not incidental meals. They were formal, structured gatherings that played a crucial role in Greco-Roman social and religious life. And these were not fellowship meals tacked onto a separate worship service. They were the worship service. As the scholar Dennis E. Smith puts it, the entire gathering, from the food to the teaching to any hymns or prayers that might have been done, all of this happened at the table itself. Generally speaking, a deipnon involved two phases, a food phase and a wine-drinking phase called a symposion or potos. But the details varied a lot. Some were modest, others were lavish. They might be a family affair or a public event. They could be a solemn religious ceremony or a wild drunken party. Seating arrangements varied too. Guests might recline on couches arranged in a triclinium, a formal dining room with 3 couches arranged around a central table. Sometimes guests gathered around a crescent-shaped table called a stabadium. Now, we don't exactly know the setup for these Eucharistic meals in Corinth. Paul briefly mentions a few chapters later that the Corinthian church sat during worship, and since we're talking about a meal here, they were probably seated around a table, either in a dining room or, if the group was too large, in some more spacious area like an atrium or courtyard. A deipnon also included religious elements. Some began with a prayer, a hymn, or a libation of wine poured out to honor the gods. After the food, it was common to offer a toast or another libation to the patron deity as the gathering transitioned into the wine-drinking phase. These events could also include discussions of philosophy, theology, or ethics. So any prayers, hymns, or teachings conducted at a Christian Eucharistic meal would not have been out of the ordinary. And of course, you can't have a banquet without food. Bread was the cornerstone of most meals in the ancient Mediterranean, and sometimes bread was the entire meal. If you didn't have much money back then, some bread and water would have been considered a normal, frugal meal in and of itself. So the fact that Christian Eucharistic meals revolved around bread wasn't unusual. Even unleavened bread wasn't particularly exotic, despite its strong association with the Jewish Passover. Leavened bread was more labor-intensive and was pricier, so for economic reasons, plenty of people, Jews and non-Jews alike, ate unleavened bread or boiled or dry roasted their grain and ate it like that. But Dr. Bradshaw suggests that the strong emphasis on bread at these meals was not only economic, it was also likely a conscious effort to avoid foods associated with the pagan sacrifices. See, depending on the wealth of the host, a deipnon might also include small amounts of cheese, olives, fish, or meat. But meat was expensive and typically associated with religious sacrifice, since the meat from sacrificed animals was typically sold or distributed to the community. This apparently was a big problem for a lot of ancient Christians. Paul's extended reflections elsewhere about whether Christians could consume meat sacrificed to Greco-Roman gods suggest this was a live issue. You can imagine the tension. If the worship service doubled as a shared meal and someone brought a platter of leftover meat from the Temple of Apollo down the street, suddenly the dinner becomes a theological debate. Still, the meal in Corinth probably included more than just bread and wine, possibly other side dishes, including meat. In fact, it's possible that everyone brought their own food to the gathering. The scholar Peter Lampy argues that the Lord's Supper in Corinth resembled a type of dinner party known as an eranos, a variation of the traditional deipnon where guests contributed their own food, something like an ancient potluck. This might explain why the host in Corinth was apparently not controlling the meal, and why Paul complains that each one goes ahead with his own meal without sharing. Wine was also a staple of the ancient Mediterranean diet, and it was not necessarily a luxury beverage. Everyone drank wine, from enslaved people all the way up to the emperor himself. It was actually a meaningful source of calories and nutrition for a person living in an agrarian society. Now, like I said, at a deipnon, wine was usually served after the food, during a second, more relaxed phase of the evening called the symposium. This could feature conversation or entertainment like singing, dancing, or games. But the lines between food and entertainment were not rigid. Greek and Roman writers mention guests conducting readings and philosophical discussions before the food or even during the meal, so the flow of the evening could vary. Nothing was locked into a fixed sequence. So let's review. Paul himself uses the Greek word deipnon to describe the Lord's Supper, the common term for a dinner party. What did that involve? Well, bread and wine were totally normal. Prayers and religious songs? Not unusual. Even philosophical or ethical discussions after a meal were not out of the ordinary. So, as one scholar puts it, it is now widely held that early Christians organized their community meals along the lines of Greco-Roman dining, adapting the format to meet their own ritual needs. In other words, the Eucharistic meals did have distinct Christian elements, but it looked and felt like a standard banquet to anyone in the Greco-Roman world. Now, I'm not saying that the Eucharistic meals were not meaningful. These meals were definitely meaningful. They were ritualized and symbolic, but not much would have struck your ordinary person as unusual. Now, to be fair, the symbolism of eating the body and blood of Christ did attract negative attention, ridicule, and even accusations of cannibalism from outside observers. So the symbolism did strike many Greeks and Romans as odd, but the form of the actual meal was common, ranging from the menu of bread and wine to the presence of religious elements like hymns or prayers for a particular deity. So Paul gives us what's possibly our earliest window into Eucharistic practice, and his description sounds a lot like Greco-Roman banquets. But when we fast forward a few decades to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see a different framing emerge, one that ties the ritual to a Jewish holiday, Passover. And a lot of people are quick to jump to the conclusion that the Eucharist was in some way modeled on Jewish Passover meals, something like a Christianized Passover Seder. In Hebrew, the word Seder means order or procedure, and a Passover Seder is a ritual meal celebrated by Jews at the beginning of Passover, featuring symbolic foods, specific prayers, and the retelling of the Exodus story in a set order. The Gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke, notably not John, frame the Last Supper as a Passover celebration, though it's debated whether we can call it a Seder. The scholar of ancient Judaism Jonathan Klawans argues that while Jesus may have eaten a Passover meal with his disciples, there's no clear evidence it looked anything like the Seder familiar today, as in a structured meal with multiple ritual cups, set blessings and prayers, and symbolic explanations. We get the first detailed picture of this version of a Seder from a collection of oral Jewish law called the Mishnah, which was compiled around 200 CE, over 170 years after Jesus. Now, the Mishnah probably does preserve some historical evidence of Jewish practices that were already in use during the time of Jesus, but we just can't know for sure how widespread or consistent those practices actually were in the first century, nor can we assume that the Seder in its later form was already developed in the time of Jesus. As Dr. Klawans puts it, most of the supposed parallels between the Last Supper and a Seder, like bread and wine, reclining and singing, were just typical features of any formal Jewish meal. For example, Jesus opens the meal with a cup in the Gospel of Luke, which echoes meals described in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which also open with a cup of wine and a blessing, but are not Passover Seders. And as the liturgical historian Andrew McGowan points out, formal Jewish meals like the Passover banquet were themselves part of a broader Mediterranean banqueting tradition. They shared many features with Greco-Roman dining: formal seating arrangements, prayers over wine, symbolic foods, and multiple courses. Even the Seder described in the Mishnah was not a radical departure from this cultural context. Rather, it turns the meal into a series of structured mini-banquets. So while Matthew, Mark, and Luke frame the Last Supper as a Passover celebration, and it does echo Jewish practice on some level, it should not be viewed as isolated from the wider Greco-Roman dining culture. That's why Dr. McGowan warns us that it is misleading to see the Eucharist as a sort of Christianized Seder in that later and more developed sense. Jewish meals like those described in the Dead Sea Scrolls are useful comparisons, but none of them provide a simple model adopted or adapted for Christian use. The Eucharist emerges in the same world as these forms, but developing alongside rather than merely out of them. And more to the point, Paul's account in 1 Corinthians doesn't mention Passover at all, and the Gospel of John places the meal several days before Passover. So whether we even call it a Passover celebration depends on whether we're following the timeline in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or the timeline in John's Gospel. And a lot of scholars question the historicity of the Last Supper altogether, not only because of calendar inconsistencies between John and the other Gospels, but because they argue it would be highly improbable that an observant Jew such as Jesus would use the language of eating flesh or drinking blood. The Torah strictly prohibits consuming blood, and the idea of symbolically consuming human flesh would have been unthinkable. The scholar F. Gerald Downing writes, there is no plausible Jewish context in which this might seem acceptable. The scholar J. Fenton argues that the taboo against eating a human body and drinking any sort of blood was so strong that it is impossible to imagine any Jew of the first or any other century seriously inviting his friends to do it. And the biblical studies scholar Michael Cahill has gone so far as to criticize his fellow scholars for glossing over this issue, calling attention to how rarely the Jewish dietary implications of the Last Supper are taken seriously. To complicate the issue even more, one of the oldest Eucharistic texts never even refers to the Last Supper story from the Gospels, which raises the question, how central could this story have been to the origin of the ritual if early Christians could perform it without mentioning the Last Supper at all? Let's take a closer look at the Eucharistic meal described in the Didache, or the teaching. This is a kind of early Christian handbook, a practical guide for how early Christian communities should live, worship, and organize. The Didache was compiled in stages as early as the 1st century, and it contains instructions for the Eucharist that are very different from what's described by Paul and the Gospels. Concerning the Eucharist, give thanks thus. First, concerning the cup, we give thanks to you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your servant, which you have revealed to us through Jesus, your servant. And concerning the broken bread, we give thanks to you, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you have revealed to us through Jesus, your servant. As this broken bread was scattered upon the hills and has been gathered to become one, so gather your church from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. Here we have a ceremony called a Eucharist that involves both bread and wine, but the meanings assigned to those symbols differ from our Eucharist today. No reference to the crucifixion, no reference to the Last Supper of Christ, no body, no blood. Instead, in the Didache, the cup of wine represents a grapevine, a metaphor for King David. The exact meaning of this metaphor is debated, but one plausible interpretation that it reflects the belief that non-Jewish believers can now share in the blessings once promised to Israel and its greatest king, David. The bread, meanwhile, symbolizes the unity of the Christian community. Just as scattered grains are gathered and baked into one loaf, so too are believers, spread across many different regions, gathered into God's kingdom. So when the Didache community met for their Eucharistic meals, they apparently did not consider themselves to be consuming the body and blood of Jesus, or even commemorating his death. Rather, they were celebrating the unity of their membership and their devotion to Jesus, who they regarded as the faithful servant of God foretold in the Hebrew Bible. This is a very ancient form of the Eucharist. Some scholars even think it is the oldest Eucharistic text, possibly predating the Gospels and maybe even predating Paul. Now, I think that's a bit of a stretch. The consensus is that the Didache dates to the late 1st century or maybe the early 2nd century, but at the very least, the Didache does contain the oldest surviving Eucharistic prayer, since Paul doesn't go into much detail about the precise rituals and prayers conducted during those meals. So the Didache shows that alternate forms of the Eucharist were being practiced as early as the late 1st century. The scholars who think that this version might predate Paul suggest that the Last Supper story was thus developed later, providing a theological explanation for an already existing ritual. Other scholars like Andrew McGowan think that the Didache community probably did know about the Last Supper tradition, but they didn't see it as central to the ritual. Either way, the Didache challenges the common assumption that early Christians created the Eucharist to imitate the Last Supper. Instead, Greco-Roman banquets appear to be the closest parallel, and specifically banquets held by organizations that scholars call Greco-Roman associations. These were social and religious organizations that flourished in the Greco-Roman world during the Hellenistic period into the Roman Empire, gathering around a particular shared interest, god, or identity. Aristotle himself mentions these organizations. Some associations appear to be formed for the sake of pleasure, for example religious guilds and dining clubs, which are unions for sacrifice and social intercourse. English has a lot of words that might describe groups like this: clubs, guilds, fraternities, societies, lodges, and the Greeks and Romans had a variety of terms too, describing different types of associations. The Greek term theosos describes clubs that were mostly religious in nature. Aranoi refers to those potluck dining clubs I already mentioned. And the Latin term collegium could refer to civil or religious societies. Associations is the modern academic term to refer to these groups. Greco-Roman associations typically consisted of a few dozen members. Some revolved around a shared profession or trade, basically like an occupational guild. For example, ancient inscriptions mention shipbuilders associations, blacksmith guilds. There's even a gravestone from Greece that mentions a guy named Aelius Orestes that says, "The Society of Donkey Drivers set this up as a memorial." So basically, the donkey drivers in this town had a professional guild, and they pooled their resources to pay for their members' gravestone. Other associations centered on an ethnic identity, like an immigrant community. For example, this inscription from the Black Sea coast west of Constantinople mentions an immigrant community of Alexandrian businessmen. The Alexandrians engaged in business in Perinthos set up this statue for the sake of honor. Other associations were basically religious organizations for a particular god. For example, this inscription in the Vatican Museum contains the bylaws of an association for the god Asclepios. It names the officers of the organization, including a club president, supervisors, and members who are exempt from paying dues. It stipulates that the group has a fixed cap of 60 members and explains how members can bequeath their membership to close relatives or other citizens, and also lays out a rich festival calendar of banquets, where members received measured portions of bread, wine, and small cash handouts. One entry reads, "On the 22nd of February, the anniversary of our beloved pact, in the same place near the Temple of Mars, they shall distribute the gifts of bread and wine." So in many ways, these Greco-Roman associations functioned a lot like modern-day clubs or guilds. They had elected officers, collected membership dues, they drafted formal rules for membership and behavior, especially at their banquets, and they managed shared resources like funds and meeting spaces. Some of the more established associations even maintained dedicated clubhouses with banqueting halls and shrines, and sometimes even doorkeepers and bouncers to monitor access. Less well-funded groups might have met in inns, public forums, or members' homes. So whether organized around a trade, a shared homeland, or a particular god, these associations offered a sense of belonging and mutual support in the urban fabric of the ancient Mediterranean. And as we saw with that Asclepios association, communal meals were arguably the most important part of these associations. And these meals were not just social, they were religious events with offerings, prayers, and hymns. Even the clubs oriented around an ethnicity or an occupation like that donkey drivers club had a more or less religious character. Many of these clubs were named after gods, even if the group wasn't an explicitly religious group. Their meeting places even sometimes featured religious installations like altars or divine statues. And the associations often donated money to conduct sacrifices in order to provide meat for their communal meals. One inscription from the 2nd or 3rd century CE lays out detailed instructions on how to organize a ritual potluck for the god Men Tyrannos. Those who wish may convene an aranos for Men Tyrannos. The club members shall provide what is appropriate for the god. Then it lists the items each member should bring: meat, wine, cakes, oil, and fruit. Everyone contributes, and the meal is both a sacrifice and a feast for the god. Another example comes from the bylaws of an association for Zeus in Roman Egypt. You shall arrange one banquet a month in the sanctuary of Zeus. There they should pour libations, pray, and perform the other customary rites on behalf of the god and Lord the king. These meals were ritual and social gatherings. They followed specific rhythms of prayer, discussions, and shared food, sometimes held in sanctuaries, sometimes in dedicated clubhouses, and sometimes in the home of one of their members. The Christian Eucharistic meals fit neatly within the broader Greco-Roman tradition of banqueting, following the basic structure and pattern of Greco-Roman associations. As the scholar Dr. Marcus Oehler puts it, it is quite justified to say that early Christian meals were nothing else than association meals. They gave bread and wine and probably other complementary food as a sacrifice to the Kyrios, the Lord. They prayed, sang hymns, heard readings and speeches, and they had their cultic meal. Another scholar, Dennis E. Smith, argues when early Christians met for meals, they were engaging in a practice common to all religious people and sectarian groups in the ancient world. Like other such groups, they utilized the banquet institution with its rich symbolism, and adapted it according to their own special needs and emphases. Thus, the origin of early Christian meals is not to be found in any one type or originating event, but rather in the prevailing custom in the ancient world for groups to gather at table. In fact, the similarities annoyed some Christians. Initiates of the religion known as Mithraism apparently held sacred meals. And writing in the 2nd century, the Christian theologian Justin Martyr accuses the followers of Mithras of imitating the Eucharistic meal during their own meetings. Some 50 years later, the apologist Tertullian made a similar claim, arguing that the devil himself had taught Mithraists to imitate the Eucharist and other Christian sacraments. Now, no one believes that worshippers of Mithras stole the Eucharist from Christians, or vice versa, and there's good reason to question if Justin Martyr or Tertullian really had accurate knowledge of Mithraic communal meals, but they were both participating in the same cultural phenomenon. Scholars increasingly think that communal meals and their associated rituals were rooted in the ancient Greco-Roman phenomenon of voluntary associations, which were one of the ancient world's most important social institutions. The scholar John Kloppenborg has even argued that our translation choices have obscured this reality, making things sound more churchy when we could just as easily make them sound more like Greco-Roman associations. For example, Christians called their groups ecclesia, which is often translated as church, but it was really just the standard Greek word for a citizen assembly, a term used for everything from local councils to civic gatherings. Likewise, we tend to translate the word episkopos as bishop, but it just meant something like supervisor, a role held in other Greco-Roman associations. According to Kloppenborg, when we render these terms in overtly ecclesiastical language, we risk isolating early Christian groups from the wider social world that they were a part of, when in fact their organizational vocabulary overlapped heavily with other voluntary associations. And the same goes for Paul's use of the word deipnon, often translated as supper, when it was just the ordinary Greek word for a dinner party or banquet. Calling it the Eucharist adds a layer of liturgical and theological weight that was not necessarily there in the original context. So if Christian Eucharistic meals started as Greco-Roman inspired banquets, when and how exactly did they shift from a substantial evening meal to token food rituals? In the earliest decades of Christianity, there wasn't really a distinction between the Eucharist and the meal, as in there's no evidence in the earliest decades that there was a special moment during the meal when people ate consecrated bread and wine. Dr. Bradshaw writes, on the contrary, it seems to be a pure product of the minds of modern scholars who find it impossible to imagine that early Christians might have viewed the whole meal as sacred, as the Eucharist. But at some point, Christians did abandon the full meal for a ritualized consumption of a small amount of bread and wine, or water. More on that later. We don't know exactly when and why that shift happened. The Eucharist continued to be a full meal for at least a few hundred years. Around 200 CE, 150 years after Paul, the Christian theologian Tertullian describes a Eucharistic meal that, again, sounds like any other banquet. We do not recline until we have first tasted of prayer to God. As much is eaten as to satisfy the hungry, only as much is drunk as is proper to the chaste. After water for washing the hands and lights, each is invited to sing publicly to God as able from Holy Scripture or from their own ability. Thus how each has drunk is put to the test. Similarly, prayer closes the feast. Tertullian makes no mention of a separate ritual moment for eating a small amount of bread and wine. Instead, he describes a full evening meal, complete with food, drink, prayers, and singing, though the food and wine must be consumed in moderation. By the 4th century, though, we have texts describing separate Eucharistic rituals during the meal. The text called the Apostolic Tradition describes such a ritual. And let the faithful who are present at the supper take from the bishop's hand a small piece of bread before they break their own bread. Before they all drink, once they have washed their hands, it is fitting that those who are present taste of the cup over which thanks have been given, and so feast. This suggests a hybrid format, a distinct Eucharistic blessing inserted into the overall meal. The faithful still wash, eat, and drink together like any other banquet, but now there's a moment of liturgical differentiation, one bite and sip set apart as sacred, even as the rest of the supper continues in typical communal fashion. Even though this text dates to the 300 CE, some scholars think that sections of it, like this section, might date back as far as the 2nd century, but we just don't exactly know when this shift occurred, though it definitely happened by the time Christians started using purpose-built structures for worship. Basilicas like this one were designed for communal ritual, not communal dining, built for processions and preaching, and not reclining around a shared table. Paul Bradshaw suggests that one of the most likely reasons for abandoning the full meal format was simply a matter of logistics. See, it's manageable to host a communal meal for a dozen people or so in your dining room, but once the Christian movement expanded to include hundreds of people gathering in a large basilica, feeding that many people became complicated, expensive, and increasingly impractical. Ritualizing the meal, reducing it to symbolic portions, was likely a natural response to that growth. This shift may have also had something to do with the shifting hour of celebration. Remember, the word deipnon refers to an evening meal, and most scholars think that the earliest Eucharistic meals were held on Saturday nights, which in the Jewish reckoning of time marked the beginning of the week. But by the mid-2nd century, we see signs of that changing. Justin Martyr, writing around 100 years after Paul, says that Christians were gathering on Sundays for the Eucharist. Now, he doesn't explicitly mention the time of day, but the context suggests a Sunday morning gathering, perhaps part of a broader shift away from a full evening meal to a symbolic ritual. Writing another 50 years after Justin, Tertullian explicitly mentions the Eucharistic meal being held on Sunday mornings. We take also in congregations before daybreak, and from the hand of none but the presidents, the sacrament of the Eucharist. Now remember when I quoted Tertullian a few minutes ago, he described the Christian Eucharist as a full-on evening banquet. So here this doesn't seem to be describing the central Christian liturgy. Dr. McGowan argues that the Sunday morning Eucharist was not the main event, but just one pious practice among others, an extra ritual layered onto the Christian week, and not a replacement for the traditional Saturday evening meal. This may have been a transitional period when the Eucharistic meal could be held on either Saturday evening or Sunday morning. And some scholars have even suggested that this shift from evening to morning may have led to smaller portion sizes, moving from a full-on meal to something more like a light breakfast. And in the Greco-Roman world, drinking wine in the morning would have been socially out of place, which may have further reduced the wine to a symbolic amount, or led to its omission altogether. A lot of Christians drank water instead of wine for their Eucharistic meals, though we learn about these groups mostly from their opponents. The early Christian theologian Irenaeus attacks a group called the Ebionites who used water instead of wine. Similarly, the bishop Epiphanius attacked the Marcionites for doing the same thing, and Clement of Alexandria disapprovingly mentions there are those who celebrate the Eucharist with mere water. Although these groups are frequently described as heretics by their opponents, apparently some otherwise Orthodox Christians were also conducting Eucharistic meals without wine. Writing in the mid-200s, Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, expresses concern that bishops in his region were offering water instead of wine. He emphatically commands them to use wine instead, arguing that wine symbolizes Christ's blood and that offering water alone cannot express the blood of Christ. But notice he's not accusing them of heresy. He's appealing to them as fellow clergy, otherwise faithful leaders who, in his view, simply misunderstood or mishandled the tradition. And the fact that he felt he needed to publish such a detailed rebuttal implies that water and bread Eucharists were very widespread in North Africa in the 200s. In fact, while wineless Eucharists are often pinned to so-called heretical groups, this practice might go back to the very first Christian communities. We've already mentioned how sacrificed meat was controversial to early Christian meals, but in Romans 14, Paul also mentions wine. Do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that makes your brother or sister stumble. In other words, abstaining from wine wasn't just tolerated, it could be seen as a pastoral concession to protect the unity of the community. This might suggest that some early Christians may have intentionally omitted wine from the Eucharist and used water, not out of heresy, but out of sensitivity to fellow believers. As Dr. Bradshaw writes, water and bread Eucharists may stretch back to the very beginnings of Christianity, rather than being a later deviation from a recognized norm. And even today, there are some Christian groups who use water and bread, such as Latter-day Saints. Overall, reconstructing the origins of the Eucharist requires us to overcome one of the biggest hurdles in the study of history, the difficulty of imagining a world unlike our own. Our knowledge of modern church rituals and inherited theological frameworks can easily obscure how differently early Christians practiced their faith, like the Eucharist mentioned in the Didache that lacks even a reference to the Last Supper. This shift in thinking has been difficult even for experts. As the scholar Margaret Daly Denton notes, the thinking of Christian scholars about Eucharistic origins was profoundly influenced and formed by their own liturgical experience. That's why recent scholarship has pushed us to zoom out, to situate Christian meals not just within biblical texts, but within the wider fabric of Greco-Roman religious culture, where communal meals were common, social, and sacred. Once we do that, the Eucharist starts to look less like a ceremony designed to replicate a single sacred moment, and more like a flexible, evolving practice, rooted in the everyday rhythms of ancient life. And that brings us to a broader point, not just about early Christianity, but about how we interpret any complex situation. Whether we're studying ancient rituals or current events, it's easy to get locked into one familiar narrative, which is why I'm always excited to introduce today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. They aggregate stories from a bunch of different media outlets and pair those stories with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting. Take the recent case of Tufts University grad student Rumeysa Öztürk, a citizen of Turkey legally in the US on a student visa. She was detained by immigration agents after being accused of supporting Hamas, even though according to Washington Post reporting, the State Department had found no evidence linking her to anti-Semitism or terrorism days before her arrest. Ground News has aggregated over a dozen media outlets covering this story, with the vast majority of the coverage coming from center and left-leaning outlets. The ownership display breaks down who controls these outlets, whether they're independently owned, backed by wealthy individuals, or part of larger media conglomerates. And the factuality rating shows that well over half of these sources are rated as highly factual. And just to note here, all of the factuality ratings are backed by independent news monitoring organizations, not Ground News itself. The headline comparison tool lets you see how different outlets frame the same story. The conservative outlet Newsmax runs a summary of the Washington Post's reporting. Wash Post, no link to anti-Semitism by Tufts student. Meanwhile, on the left, NBC News focuses on Öztürk's account of how she's been treated that she shared in a recent testimony. Tufts student ICE grabbed off street says hijab was removed. Asthma wasn't treated at Louisiana facility. This particular case also shows up in one of Ground News' most powerful features, the blind spot feed. This highlights stories that are underreported or completely absent from outlets on one side of the political spectrum or the other. It's a useful way to break out of our own news bubbles and see which topics are being amplified or ignored. If you'd like to give Ground News a try, Ground News is giving Religion for Breakfast viewers 40% off their Vantage plan. Go to ground.news/Religion for Breakfast or click the link below to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.